morning, everybody. Today we have gathered some experts who have generously donated their time to speak about something that's very relevant right now, which is working securely when working in a distributed and remote workforce. For those of you that tuned in to Jason's keynote, he touched on some pretty important topics, such as the both strategic and tactical implementations of doing this as a company, as well as the permanence of some of the adjustments we've made for COVID, which probably won't go away. Some of us may have actually used our work from home policy for the first time, while others may have had a distributed workforce already. Our panelists today are Jason, who is the Global Field Chief Technology Officer of Prisma Access at Palo Alto Networks. Thanks for joining us, Jason. Adriana, who works in cyber security and privacy at MNP in Toronto with specialization in payment security. We have John, who's the CIO at Resource Productivity at the Recovery Authority, and Michael Ball, who's a security architect, IT audit mediator, which I like that, and CISO. Myself, I'm Mark. I'm the VP of IT at Water North Hydro, a power company in Ontario, and I also am a cybersecurity professor. So my first actual work from home experience was teaching a group of students remotely, which was both better and worse than the previous experience. We're going to go through a group of questions as a panel to discuss some of the more prescient topics that are occurring right now. So I will start with Jason, and I'm going to ask, what is the most important consideration for security during a rapid cloud adoption?
Well, I would say it depends on how you're adopting it, whether you're developing inside of it or you're just moving stuff to it. But either way, I think where you have to start is how access is going to be obtained. So it's a destination, you've got a source. How is the user getting there? Is it going to be secure? If that includes developers, how are we making sure that what the developer is doing as far as code is going to be as error-free as possible once they get there? But I believe it starts with access, secure access to that service, making sure that only people that can reach that VPC or that front end can reach it, and having some type of ability to dissuade people that shouldn't have access to that cloud service from getting there. And cloud can expand to public cloud instances as well as SaaS instances. So where if you've got a corporate instance of a SaaS, you don't want external people that aren't from your organization even trying to log in. As soon as they get there and it's unrecognized, they're bounced back for some kind of challenge of authentication or something before even presented with the SaaS login itself. So it's really about, I think it's got to start with access, and then depending on what that organization is trying to do with the cloud, develop inside it or move stuff to it, then you define controls from there based on that next activity.
And Adriana, what have you seen in your work at MNP? What has there been any kind of change in cloud adoption, and what do you think some of the important steps are to take when you're doing it maybe more quickly than you're comfortable with?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, the pandemic really drove organizations to consider moving to the cloud a lot faster, to be able to have employees access the resources from anywhere they might be located. Some of the challenges that we found that some of our clients face are, as they are trying to move to the cloud, they do not have a good understanding of their security requirements already. So it becomes very difficult to go and ask the cloud provider to put security requirements around it. And now some of them could be getting more security than they previously had. It's important for them to understand what they are buying, because there is always a balance between the security that you get and the cost associated with it. Another challenge that organizations face as they move quickly to the cloud is also understanding what their data is. What is the sensitive information, sensitive assets that they might be moving to the cloud, and then what type of controls they need to implement to make that information secure. And a lot of our clients are struggling with encryption, key management, who should be managing the keys, where they should encrypt. Should they encrypt before going to the cloud, when they get there? And then once they move to the cloud, now that this environment is outside of their enterprise, how do you get visibility within the security controls that are in the cloud? So a lot of organizations are facing challenges with that. Before they were able to collect logs and have some visibility within the enterprise, within their data center. Now that is expanding to an environment where they don't have control. So what they find, defining the roles and responsibility between stakeholders becomes very important to ensure that you cover the entire life cycle of threat management, from identification to management, remediation, and obviously, in case of an incident, you have really good processes in place for incident response, and you consider how those the incident communication is going to happen, and finally, how do you train your resources? So Jason mentioned, what are you going to do? Are you going to just load the data to the cloud, or are you going to build in the cloud? So make sure that you are training your resources, so as they are building new things into the cloud, they know how to implement security and privacy by design, because otherwise it's very difficult to fix those issues later.
Yeah, the distributed nature of where your things are makes it kind of hard to keep a view on everything. So John, as a CIO, you probably were at the center of all of this happening and maybe did some of it. What did you discover?
So Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority is a fairly new organization. We've been around for a little over 3 years, and that has its benefits, because we started out with everything going in the cloud. All of our systems that we implement are cloud-based, and so it's going to COVID-19 made things. We already had a lot of the infrastructure and everything that we needed in place. I think one of the biggest concerns for us, because we are a government regulator, is that we have to make sure that the data that we store and use is secure. And so one of the things that we've always looked at is, there was an old adage that says there is no such thing as a cloud, it's just somebody else's computer. And so it's really looking at where those systems reside, because you do fall into government regulations based on the location of some of the equipment. And so we have to make sure we are obligated from as part of our mandate to ensure that the data that we record and that we manage is secure. And so that's really the big piece for us, is making sure that the data is protected.
That's very fortunate to be in that position when all of this started. It must have been like, oh, I'm glad we did that. I'm glad we didn't do something different.
Absolutely.
So, Michael, as a security architect or CISO, what kind of advice would you give when adopting cloud? Perhaps either you already have it or for the first time.
So I'm going to say I'm a virtual CISO of a bunch of small mid-tier companies. And so the challenges are a little bit different in that most smaller companies already started cloud or SaaS with most of their tooling. And so, they didn't know that they were SaaS. They just, we've got a bunch of web services out somewhere in the internet. But, the tooling is already there for things like Office 365 or SAP, Salesforce. They have toolkits that allow you to do your security assessments. When you set up the accounts, by default, they're going to be performance-based. They're going to be an access first, with security kind of taking a second wheel. But it's very easy to go in and analyze and set up things like two-factor authentication to all these. So going in and doing those assessments right off the bat was kind of how we kicked the can first.
From our perspective, or from what I've seen, one of the things that we got into at the beginning, because we have a lot of on-premise stuff, we have systems that are air gap by design, and working with a lot of SaaS providers, it felt like an overreach. Some of the things I was asking for: knowledge of third-party access. Do you have backups? Where are they? What contractors work there? Is there a security SLA where you're going to give me breach notification if you get breached? I need to know because my data's there. And it felt like I was asking companies this for the first time every time I asked them. And I was a little surprised by that. But they all eventually agreed. And I think what it comes down to is standards. So we talk about shadow IT. Moving to the cloud can kind of have some of those problems as well if you don't do it with a universal approach. And sometimes the technology, just how different it is, and in many times better ways, might change you to rethink your processes and say, you know what, they all do it this way for a reason. Maybe our process is silly and we just think it's better because it's ours. So there was some rethinking there as well. Right. So along with remote offices, they're also often homes. They're where people live. So when you have people working in their homes, what new security threats arise when you're working that way? And are there any that fall away because they're not in a centralized place? Michael, let's start with you.
Yeah, so first of all, teaching your employees how to secure their own home devices, right? So, we talk about Internet of Things. Every home is chock full of smart televisions and smart lights and hubs and switches, and so how do you teach your employees how to take care of their home security practices first, so then they can take those habits and bring them back to the office? That was sort of an awakening moment. The next thing was realizing that a significant portion of what they do day in and day out actually didn't require them to VPN or log back into the office. So we lost track of the actual devices that we had set up and were trying to manage for them. So that was a real eye-opener as well.
So that makes me think, Jason, you spoke about split tunnel versus not, and remote access from home. So what kinds of new threats do you think it introduces when people work remotely? And are there any that fall away because they're not working in a centralized place?
Yeah, I mean, I think that overall, once you connect anything to the internet, there's a level of risk. So it's how fast do you then get that traffic secured to wherever it needs to go, and potentially block out threats from there. So one of the things I mentioned in the keynote was, if you consider most knowledge workers today that access company resources from something, you got potentially a company issued laptop, but then you've got a BYO device of some sort, whether it's a tablet or a phone, and then maybe another BYO device or a corporate issued tablet or phone. So you could have potentially 3 devices, and one of them is connected to the Wi-Fi at home, or maybe 2 of them, or all 3, but 2 of them have cellular capability too, right? So now you got at least 2 to 3 gateways per person, right? And so when we think about how we secured internet gateways for a long time, it was, we need a security stack, because if you're accessing the internet's a terrible place, right? And we need to make sure that we have all this protection in there. And so now you've just replicated that and extrapolated it out as many users are at home as possible. So that's where it winds up being, if you can adopt an always on posture, because to Michael's point, when people didn't even know, or when organizations don't even know what sometimes their employees are accessing, because they lose that visibility of not coming through a VPN of some sort, they're just kind of going. And a lot of organizations did that, yes, for SaaS and cloud performance, but also to offload capacity constraints from centralized remote access gateways. It creates a problem. It just does. And that's a risk. That's a business risk decision that a lot of organizations made, to say, what's the cost of sending everybody through for some type of centralized inspection versus sending them direct? And do we have enough mitigating controls on the endpoint and the host or the application to kind of diminish that threat? And the answer is typically no. Defense in depth, I see it as more, there's authentication and other pieces, but it's really the inline piece too. It's the source, the inline connectivity, and the destination. And the destination would include things like authentication and certain host-based controls or application-based controls. But it's when you're getting there, what's happening in that session, if anything, and losing visibility of that is a bad thing. When users are working in the office, they're on a local area or a wide area network to connect to something. So to the internet, it's an ABC relationship in a lot of ways. You got a wide area connection back to an HQ or data center. Data center has egress. Now, a lot of organizations have gone the route of putting direct internet access in their branches, which is fine, but then they've got some type of security stack somewhere, whether it's on-prem or cloud-based. All of that web traffic is still trying to go through something for some type of inspection. So replicating the concept of taking your security stack with you is kind of what's got to happen. And that's why I think cloud delivered security services are robust and better, because they have ingress points or gateways as close to the user as possible. So there's not that long lag or lead time to get them to that first inspection point, then off to where they're trying to go. You have something that's a closer match between them and their destination. So I think getting that always on posture that I talked about before set up as soon as possible can mitigate as many of those home threats as possible. You still run the risk of credential theft, though. If they're off for any minute and they do something personal with that device, access what they thought was a SaaS, got redirected, right? I mean, there's clickbait out there. You can get redirected somewhere, and now all of a sudden you've got a keylogger, something else on the machine, a company issued device. Now, a lot of those security controls that are user based are kind of thrown away, right? Because you're no longer contextually validated, because something's compromised you. So I think the work at home area is a big risk. There are ways to mitigate that as much as possible. There are still going to be business decisions made around what controls we do put in place versus performance so they can work. And do we just kind of take the chance? And if we do see something, we quarantine or isolate them so they can't reconnect in. And we send some type of, repair, virtual repair of cleaning that machine for viruses and threats, whatever it is. As far as being in the office and what may have gone away from being at home, I think there's actually a fallacy of being secure in the office. I don't agree that being in the office makes you necessarily secure, even with things like network access control capabilities, because again, things can be compromised and typically they're not set up properly. So I think forcing people at home, and this is the same actual argument I have with cloud sometimes being more secure than on-prem applications, is it forces you to get identity right. So if you're forcing people at home and you're forcing them to connect up and do some type of authorization of themselves and the device and the posture and things like that, you're actually off to a better start than when you're plugging something in or attaching to a Wi-Fi access point in the office that then has potentially very, very unfettered and unrestricted access to other resources where east-west traffic and things like that could be an issue. So, I think actually you could wind up being a little more secure at home depending on how you played your cards, and if you played them right, rather than being in the office.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that, because I've thought about that a lot too. We make a lot of assumptions about our current established process. We assume that it's safe, but we apply a lot of scrutiny to new things. So I think there's a little bit of bias there.
Yep.
Adriana, what do you see as some of the bigger risks when someone's working from home versus in the office?
Yeah, and thanks for that. I'll move towards the human element of working from home. So, now we move the responsibility for protecting the data and protecting our assets to all these employees who are working in their own homes. So we need to really ensure that we educate them what that means. And it's one thing is their working environment, how to protect their devices, but also how to protect interaction with others. So now we are all doing video conferencing, being able to understand how do you do video conferencing securely? Do you record things? Where are you going to store those recordings? Unfortunately, our lives and the work have started to interact so much that you get all kinds of disruptions during those. So we see children running around behind us during those interviews. So protecting those recordings and that information about us becomes very important, because those could be used and leveraged by attackers to develop new ways of attacking us, especially as employees, because they learn so much about us and about our habits. So that's the human element. So I always say more communication is better these days. Send as you discover more tips and tools on what you can do to protect the data. But then I think on the other side, I think organizations also have an opportunity, as Jason was saying, to figure out how do you use risk-based authentication to resources? How do you do more granular access to whatever it is that you need and implement those solutions, so you actually get better security than you had prior?
Yeah, I completely agree that the human element's a big part. That's something that needs a lot of consideration, because you might be asking people to migrate to a workspace that has a lot of flaws, or just wasn't set up that way, depending on how quickly this happened. John, what have you seen? So it sounds like your place is mostly remote, but you mentioned going into the office. What do you think the differences are?
Well, I think so prior to COVID, so as of March, up until March 16th, we were 100% work in the office. And so on March 16th, we flipped the switch, sent everybody home, told them to work from home. And it's been quite an eye-opener. You have people that don't even have proper desks set up at home because they're not used to working from home. They may or may not have a router that's capable or that's set up for protecting their own internal home use computers from attack. And now you're taking a corporate device with corporate access and putting it onto that network. And so one of the things that we did was we've said that any access to, even though we're cloud, our primary system is Salesforce, and obviously you can access it anywhere on the cloud. What we've done is we've actually restricted it so that you have to either physically be in the office or you have to be connected through VPN in order to be able to get into our Salesforce instance. So it helps, but it's still not foolproof. I mean, nothing. I think Jason had said earlier that nothing's foolproof. That there are risks with any of this, and the further away from a central point you take things, the more risks there are. The old adage about you're only as strong as your weakest link. You've now taken all of your staff and you've taken them away from what most people consider to be a strong area. In other words, your office. Although Jason said, and I agree, that that's not necessarily the best or the most secure place. And you've taken that and put it into a number of different home offices. And so you're really relying on making sure that they're using VPN. One of the things that we've run into is when you get into video conferencing doesn't work that well over VPN. And so we're educating our staff on, if you're doing video conferences, disconnect from VPN. If you need access to your system, your data, you need to connect back up to the VPN. But as Adriana said, a lot of this is education. And, I'll admit that when back on March 16th, we originally thought, this could be for a couple of weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2 months. We are now setting the stage for indefinite. We've got a lot of people, especially with public transit, that aren't comfortable with public transit. You've got people that aren't comfortable with sending their kids back to school. And so this is going to be a long haul thing. And so we're now looking at it saying, okay, it was fine what we put in place for, a month or a couple of months. It's now been 5 months. It's going to go on beyond that. What do we need to do, both at the office or centrally, as well as potentially, do we need to provide our home users with additional security equipment to be able to protect them and to ultimately protect us as this goes on for a prolonged period of time? We have now, as I said, we started out being in the office 5 days a week, 100% mandatory, to we've now gotten to the point of saying, chances are we will never have 100% occupancy back at the office.
And that touches on something that Jason said in his keynote about places thinking, do I really need this lease? If I don't own my building, do I really need to spend $15,000 to $20,000 a month on this thing, or are people even happier? Not necessarily having to come in every day. You kind of reminded me when you talked about March of, I think everyone I knew was doing two things. They were calling their ISP and saying, how much bandwidth can you give me? And they were calling their computer supplier and saying, how many laptops do you have in stock?
Yep, absolutely.
So with cloud adoption and remote work, both of those things happening, maybe not both, but the remote work part too, you get this distributed and remote data set. So I'll start with you, John. What new places do you think that your data went during COVID, and how are you keeping track of where it's going?
Oh, it's absolutely staying exactly where it was. No, I mean, we do have the benefit, as I said, that we are using Salesforce. We have put in place the need for VPN access or in the office access. But having said that, there's still the ability to export data. And so to me, it has turned into, and in a lot of cases, this isn't much different for us than it was when we were in the office. We were 100% laptop already. So luckily we didn't have to go and scramble to get additional equipment. It was a matter of some tweaks to be able to enable the security that we needed remotely. But we've always had procedures and so forth and policies in place as to what you can and can't extract from the system and where you can or cannot store it. And so in a lot of cases, I think Adriana touched on it earlier, that it's the human factor, that you really have to ultimately rely on your staff to ensure that they're following protocols. We, again, because of the fact that this is turning into a much longer situation than we'd originally planned, we're now looking at ways to better secure the data, be able to track to make sure that things aren't being stored where they shouldn't be. So there's some additional equipment and pieces that we're going to have to put in place to make sure that on a long-term basis that we are protected.
So, Adriana, what would you say about how data moves around more as you increase the remoteness of your workforce?
So definitely, people will do what it's easy for them, and they will try to take data as close as possible to them so they can work. The fact that we are all using the internet and we have challenges with connectivity. And, I was in a conference call with a couple of my colleagues. They might be located in some remote locations and internet connectivity is not as good. So, yes, data is starting to go closer to the user. But I guess on the flip side, what I noticed both internally and with some of my clients, the understanding that we do need to start operating on secure sharing platforms rather than bringing the data close to us. So I've seen a lot of organizations actually building those platforms to allow their employees to connect there and do their work and share information with others outside of the organization. I have seen an increase also in organizations starting to look at data governance. So they understand where this data is, how it might flow through the organization. and starting to put security and privacy technologies in place. So even if I will extract that data, it's considered the risk and maybe encrypted before I can move it to my laptop. And when it's stored on my laptop, is encrypted. So we see some of that happening now. So more focus on data governance and data controls, definitely.
So, Jason, speaking of some of those controls, and what's a good way to keep track of this data? It moves all over the place, and what are some of the new places that you'd consider risky that it might go to?
Well, I think I'll go back even a little bit to why shadow IT again existed in the first place. I don't think that was malice on behalf of a lot of employees or users. I think it was the fact that they needed to use something to do their job more efficiently, and IT wasn't giving them the right tools. I mean, in IT, we went from being a service provider, right? Here's an email tool. Here's a data storage tool. Here's a something. Half the users are like, I don't even know why I need this, right? And others were like, well, thanks, but I work with a third party that uses a completely different tool, yet you haven't allowed that in my organization, but I'm going to figure out a way to use it anyway. And so I think a lot of this also was, the CISO's more draconian approach to control for a while, which was if we didn't sanction it, shut it off. We enforce standards throughout the organization for good reason. I mean, you've got compliance concerns, you've got audit controls, you've got all kinds of things. You just can't have a Wild West approach to things out there. But the reality is, there are tools needed by others in organizations. So by taking a access-based approach, let's just use SaaS, as the topical piece here. The right type of CASB that can, one, assess risk to where the user's going, but two, can enforce a sanctioned, unsanctioned, or tolerated approach where you've got everybody has a sanctioned app, but we're going to control access to that instance so that it's coming from our IP ranges or our user domain, whatever it is. You set that up, as John was talking about, making sure that that's secure that way. But then you've also got unsanctioned, which is like, okay, this is bad SaaS. It's high risk. Nobody should be using this for any good reason. Make sure that that's blocked for everybody. But then you've got tolerated, which is we're not going to allow this opened up for everybody. But there is a business unit over here, or a group of users that need it for a reason. That there's maybe some supply chain work going on. That if we were to block that, we could actually shut down millions of dollars a day worth of product flow, which could be a business detriment. So we're going to tolerate it for that group, maybe put additional controls on it, such as you can only upload certain files or you can only download certain files. It's not free reign of that service. So I think having the right SaaS controls that you can, one, identify risk of that SaaS, so you can maybe allow a risk tolerance level of, okay, if it's got a risk score of 80% or higher, you're good. You can go ahead and use it. You don't need to go through IT for it. You figure it out. But then even then, we're going to only give you certain types of access till you do call IT and say, here's my business justification for using this tool and why I need to be able to upload, download, or share files between it. But with that, there's that other CASB piece of now you've got APIs for data at rest. What's happening in that data once it's there. As I talk a lot about inline security, in-transit security, and stuff like that. But that's data in motion, right? There's a lot you can do with data in motion. Data at rest, when it's left your building, it's literally left the building, is the problem, right? And that's where we need to make sure we have controls that are saying, all right, now that it's there, who's accessing it? What are they doing with it? Is it being moved or manipulated in a way that's compliant with what we need to do, or to mitigate non-compliance? And we put those controls in place. So I think it starts with access first, and then what can they do once they get there? And then once it's there, do we have the right controls to notify us when something's happening? Do we have some automation in place that says, okay, if we do see data movement, can we shut that down? Like, do we have an API call that we could write that says, stop that data flow right now, or at least spawn an alert to the SOC that then can take action to figure out what's actually happening? But it's that visibility piece that we just can't compromise on. And I do think working at home has opened up the door to some of that again, because I appreciate everything John's done. When he says we were cloud first for a long time, I'm like, thank you. That's music to my ears. But with that whole swivel chair now of, if I'm going to connect to Salesforce, I got to be on VPN or in the office. If I'm going to connect to some other app, I'm shutting VPN down. If they don't reconnect and they try to access some type of SaaS that doesn't have an instance governance on it, meaning, we haven't sanctioned it, we don't have an instance of our own, or they want to access something brand new, you don't have visibility to it. So now you're going to try to retroactively correct that access, and how you get some type of log on the device that says this user accessed this while they were off of VPN. Okay. You're going to be, with all of our users working at home, that's hunting for another needle in another haystack as far as what just happened. So how do we get control of that? So if we have that always on type of, protection, we can then start to mitigate a lot of that unused or unsanctioned SaaS. And so then if somebody does call and say, hey, you didn't give this to me, but I need it, and here's why. Okay, then we open it up. But it starts with that visibility piece, and I do think working from home has opened that door up to be almost that more shadowy IT feel again. What can we access now that we don't have to connect to VPN for certain parts of the day or for certain apps? Because that's where the control is, right?
Jason, I like something you said there. It kind of reminded me of. It made me think of framing things so that security posture in the business changes from I'm going to keep the business safe from what risk you might introduce to I'm going to keep you safe while you work. And I think that's a good approach to both the different things people can do during remote work, and also shadow IT is not over, right? It's not, we're all, it's not dead. It's still certainly happening.
Absolutely.
Michael, what are your thoughts on the distribution of data and how best to work with companies to help them understand where is their stuff going and how do they figure out where that even is?
So, and I do have to thank Jason for bringing up the CASB conversation, because it's basically we're in a position now where identity is the new perimeter, right? So we're not sitting, at a corporate office on a corporate network on a corporate device. As Jason said earlier, we could have any one of 3 or 4 or 5 different devices, either assigned to us or privileged, a BYO. So with CASB, basically leveraging off of identity and context. This is, even before COVID, we had the opportunity with CASB to say, okay, I'm going to give you this device. I'm going to assign it to you. There's going to be a certificate on it that your CASB will identify and allow certain amounts of context. Your credentials will then have other pieces of context associated with them. And we're going to monitor you. So if you're on the corporate LAN, on a corporate device using your corporate credentials, you're going to get carte blanche access to what is within the purview of your role. However, if you take that corporate device and you go to a Starbucks LAN, maybe I'm going to disable printing. Maybe I'm going to just give you a view to your data that you can't copy it, that sort of thing. So we've had that ability for a while, but now we're in the sort of the golden era where it actually makes sense to leverage it, and it's scalable. My 50-seat mom and pop shop can go out and subscribe to a CASB and make it relevant. A 2,000 or 14,000 or 50,000 seat enterprise customer can subscribe to a CASB service. And because it works on identity and session management, it's a little more lightweight than a VPN, and still allows them to do things like plug into and integrate with data loss prevention tools and their SIM, their SOC. There's still a lot of flexibility and security controls that you can integrate with that CASB solution, and using identity as your primary perimeter. I'm going to stand off the soapbox now.
Yeah, so I think that's an evolving approach that I agree. I'm seeing it at maturity, where I think it's something that organizations need to consider, whether they're hearing about it for the first time or they've been eyeing it and thinking, yeah, we should try that. And with that, to a certain extent, when you talk about your perimeter, whatever that is, right? That might be a building or it might be identity perimeter. I love that. That's a great term. One of the things we think about a lot are security appliances, and so we're hearing about next generation firewalls, and to me what that means is a appliance that's more aware, like you mentioned, identity, what are they doing? You know, you've got things that have been around for a little bit, like, you know, layer 7 awareness. And I like the puzzle you built where you said, well, where are they? What are they using? Where are they coming from? And what are they going to? And all of those things can become factors into. I'm not trying to answer the question, but what are some of the best practices when you're bringing in next generation firewalls, specifically around people that are accessing your stuff from not within your perimeter? And we'll start with you, Michael.
Yeah, so a lot of it just comes down to setting it up for in training mode and getting a baseline for your company, understanding, from a roles perspective, so integrating with things like Active Directory, your OU structure, and making sure that that next generation firewall not only is in tune to the anomalies and the threats that are coming in from external threat sources, but also understands the contextual workflow of your business. Put it in training mode, get to understand what that baseline looks like, and then slowly, turn on the rules to block mode. I think Jason's probably a better one to talk about that whole piece.
Yeah, that's about what I was thinking as well. I've gone through those training modes before, and I think it's important you don't have false positives, or everyone's gonna say no, shut that thing off. Jason, what do you have to say about implementing and controlling next generation firewalls?
Sure. I mean, the beauty of a good next generation firewall is it operates at the user to application layer, and when that happens, what we're able to do is apply all of that user context, application context, what the user can do with the application once, in line with some type of, prevention of malicious behavior and mitigation of certain threats that is happening in real time in line. So the next generation firewall, there are plenty of vendors out there that say the idea or the concept of the next generation firewall is really kind of dead right now. We don't really need it. We can supplement it with a combination of a CASB and a proxy and a software defined perimeter. The reality is there is nothing on the market right now that can fully inspect all traffic in line other than a next generation firewall. When you think of something like a CASB or a proxy or even a software defined perimeter, they're proxy based approaches, which means that by nature, a web proxy is proxying and inspecting certain protocols. And those are proxy aware protocols. If your application is communicating over ports and protocols that are not web based or DNS based or FTP based, non-proxy aware protocols, they can't be inspected. So that's the reason all those other services have a bypass list, is because you can't inspect them. And so at least a next generation firewall is that approach of it's not port or protocol dependent. It can inspect anything it wants because there is no dependency or firewall awareness required by an application in order to function properly for the session to be established and maintained. And so making sure that you have that in place means you can inspect anything you want to be able to inspect. What you don't should be then up to your policy, not up to a limitation of your security tools. So having that gives you the ability to inspect everything with SSL decrypt at scale, whatever you want to be able to do. And it just keeps you from being limited. So different types of SaaS applications you can inspect in line without necessarily certain types of CASB capabilities. You can get by a little bit without them. You can replace secure web gateways with firewalls for a lot of that internet security, creating more of a secure internet gateway, for all traffic types over the internet. So, but the beauty of it is next gen just means the ability to establish policy between a user and an application. So now you got all of that typical inspection capability, plus the awareness, the contextual awareness of what that user's trying to access and what they're trying to do with it, that allows you to make better risk-based decisions on your policy. Yes, allow this user access to this resource, but only to do this, and it can be adaptive, right? To Michael's point, identity being the new perimeter is an awesome thing. It allows us to say not only this user can do certain things with this or access these applications, but then given the context of that user, yes, on my corporate issued laptop, I have full access to this particular application. When I'm coming in over a BYO device, you can then tailor that. I still have access to the application, but now I can only view. Right, so it's adaptive based on that. And then if my behavior changes within the session, then you can actually tailor my access further. Maybe something jumped, an IP address jumped, so the source I was coming in at wound up being where I should have been, and then somehow I was hijacked, and now it's coming in from Moscow. You can terminate the session immediately, or you can do a redirect for some type of SAML assertion to get me to re-authenticate. There's certain things that you can do there, with a firewall being that enforcement point that is allowing you to really move yourself forward with the user ID, app ID policy, but just getting all of that rich inspection, all of that censoring, all of that context that you're just not getting if you start to bypass one thing after another with other security tools.
Great explanation. Adriana, how are you seeing this new technology and its depth and ability affecting the work you do?
Yeah, so we do see quite a bit customers looking forward and thinking, what we used to have in terms of firewalls on our enterprise is not what we should be looking at in the future. So a lot of them are looking towards leveraging firewalls as a service, whereas Jason and Mike mentioned where you provide a flexible architecture to provide that entry point for all the users, regardless if they are customers or employees, and regardless where they are coming from, and leverage centralized policies, risk capabilities to provide access to resources based on who they are and the risk profile. So we see quite a bit our clients looking towards that type of architecture going forward as well. And identity becomes really a big factor in the play for everybody, looking at zero trust models for security architecture going forward, and how they use identity and risk profiles to get access to resources. So that's where I see our clients going.
And John, I'm assuming that you do have a perimeter firewall, even though you're using mostly cloud, and that you have, something relatively new. Tell us about how that's working out.
Yeah, we do have firewall technology in place. It is, I would not say that it's the most sophisticated out there, because we haven't needed it. But and in this discussion, one of the things that I would say is that we have really moved to, the old style firewalls was really protect your indoor or your inside to make sure nobody could get in from the outside. And although that's still a requirement, now we're looking at, because everybody's working remotely and we still do have a central point even going out to our cloud services, they still come in through that firewall and then go back out. There's now a need, and this kind of talks about one of the things that Jason had talked about earlier, was being able to keep track of your data. Like, where's your data going? And so one of the things that I would be looking for in our next gen firewall is, what more can we do with it? Is there ways that we can track inbound and outbound data? And kind of like the old check-in, check-out style of data, that, well, we know Sam checked out this file through the firewall and it's still on his machine and it never got checked back in. So we know that it still exists there. And, what types of things can we do? That's what I'm looking for and will be looking for moving forward, is as I said earlier, that, this is the new normal. Having the ability, from our instance, I no longer can say, I don't have to worry about things because everybody has to be in the office or connected to VPN. This is a completely changing landscape, and we need to look at what do we need to change in order to be protected and to keep our stakeholders' data protected.
So, John, I'll start with you again, because you've recently had a bunch of people start working remotely that didn't before. And so one of the things you've lost access to are your company assets. you may have had a schedule and a way that you did patching and maybe even auditing of those devices. How do you do that now that they're not in the building?
So the patching is quite easy because we're still doing it. It was always done essentially remote, anyways. It's so the patching is done regardless, as long as people turn their computers on. Um, you know, they get patched on a regular basis. We do keep track of which machines have or have not been patched. Um, but it's the whole thing of a remote workforce is very new to us. One of the things that I'm faced with right now is that we are starting our evergreening process to replace laptops. And so now you start looking at, well, if they were all in the office, it's easy. You just take the old one, you take the new one, you sit them side by side, and you can transfer all of the data and shortcuts and everything else that you need to. Now we're looking at how do we do that remotely, and so it has certainly created some new challenges.
Yeah, that's I think a challenge that we're all facing. Adriana, what do you think about the idea of being responsible for an asset that the business runs, endpoint applications, and you may not see it for a year? And are there other things in scope? Do you care about that router in that home, or how do we approach that?
Well, so I think there are solutions today, third-party solutions or automated solutions that you can employ to provide those connectivities, and as computers connect to push patches to them. And companies are starting to leverage some of those, the next generation endpoint solutions, to figure out how to patch some of those computers that you don't see very often, to help minimize the risk to the enterprise. But definitely, I was talking to my husband the other day, and we were talking about what are the routers that we have in our house, and should we be looking at upgrading those? Or so I'm sure people who are not in this field might not be paying attention to those things. So we might have to employ in the future maybe services where we do need to go and make changes to the tools that people have in their houses to maintain that the security or the confidentiality of data that they might have. So I think looking forward, that organizations are really starting to kind of grasp what does it mean being a long-term operations of remote workforce, and what are some of the solutions that they can put in place to ensure the security of those environments.
Jason, one of the things you talked about was the idea of bringing your security stack with you. How does that work with endpoint applications and devices?
Really, I mean, the idea of being able to take anything with you in the literal sense is going against the idea of what we all think of in a way. Well, at least what I think of is endpoint utopia, which is I don't care. I don't care what happens to the endpoint. It could be infected with whatever it wants. It's not going to affect or impact my environment, my data, whatever it is. So, but when I say taking the security stack with you, it means it's always available at scale and wherever you're going. So from my perspective, that is a cloud delivered security stack, but it's the full stack. It is something that doesn't compromise on what you're trying to access. It's not having two separate cloud security stacks that I've got to pivot between, or somebody's got to, make sure are orchestrated somehow, some way. It's saying, what are the controls that I need? And what are the right controls for my environment based on where my data is? And then how do I make sure that stays in line with me wherever I go without impeding performance? And that is a cloud delivered capability, that's got as much distribution and throughput as it can. But that's more what I mean, is it's assessing really, because I even think back to some of the discussions I do have at Palo Alto Networks. It's the firewall company. Everybody knows it's a firewall company. And we do a lot with cloud security. We have a CASB and we have our cloud delivered firewall capability, but they're always asking, well, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to be when you grow up? And it's like, well, look, when we were first born 16 years ago, what were you trying to do? We were trying to secure data that was in the data center, right? And users were in offices, and so we were making sure that the data was protected. Now that there is that ubiquity and ubiquitousness to data and where users work, we want to stay that same or maintain that same relevance. So we're just following the data. We're just continuing to push these capabilities out there. So we have container series firewalls, VMs for public cloud security, and workload cloud to cloud security, things like that. The access to it through a certain firewall capability. So taking the security stack to me means just making sure that you have the means to connect to what amounts to a full security stack inline at scale with a single management capability, so that your policy really follows the user too. Like I said before, you build your policy, you build it for what you're accessing, whether you're in the office to a data source, wherever that is, data center or cloud, SaaS, doesn't matter. But when I leave the premises, that policy and that same security stack follows me. I'm not egressing out of a centralized security stack with a certain set of policies when I'm in the office, but then when I go home, I'm using a completely different tool set and different policy, because you're going to have inconsistency, probably some visibility and or control gaps. So taking this stack with you means it's the same stack when I'm on-prem that's connected up somehow. When I'm off net, I'm connecting that same stack, cloud delivered. That's typically what I'm getting at.
Awareness too, right?
And lastly, Michael, what advice would you have for for any company or any people that are struggling with managing their endpoint security, especially if they're new to being remote?
Yeah. So I have to, do the plug thing is get a consultant in, take a look, do an assessment of what your profile is and where you sit in the maturity across all the, endpoint protection, perimeter protection, identity protection, and you can't be all things. Find somebody that's an expert and have them come and help you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. One of the things I say is you shouldn't outsource your understanding, but if no one in your company knows, don't pretend you do. So before we go to open questions, I want to thank each of you for taking the time to discuss this. It's been something that I think we've all lived through from different perspectives, and I want to thank siberX for making this whole experience possible, as much non-remote as is possible while we're all in different places. And hopefully at one point we can all get together and do this in person in the future. And so I'll hand it over to siberX and see, do we have any questions that are waiting for us?
Yes, Mark. We have about 2.5 minutes, and there is one question, and it's targeted at Adriana, but I think everybody can sort of chime in here. I'm assuming you can all hear me, seeing your wonderful facial expressions. Adriana, the question is, and I'll rephrase it just a little bit for you. The question reads something to the effect of, important decisions and confidential decisions still need to be made for businesses to continue operations. A lot of this are happening, board meetings, for example, are happening via video conferencing. What are some suggestions that you have to secure and encrypt these sessions? And secondly, how do we ensure that board members themselves or key strategic decision makers are aware of how to maintain confidentiality when having such meetings remotely and through video?
And that's a very good question. And, I started with education. So we don't need to educate just our employees. We do need to educate our board members as well. So obviously, they do have a duty of care themselves. So they need to understand what is their duty of care around confidentiality of information. And from the perspective of video conferencing, so I guess it was quite publicized so much about how some of the tools that we were using right at the beginning had vulnerabilities in them. So what I find these days, there are security controls within these tools where you can decide who can join a meeting, or you have to accept them to come to the meeting. You can lock the meeting once all the participants are there. and you can encrypt the data if you choose to record those meetings and put controls in place around how that data can be shared and what are some of the secure platforms that you can use in the future, even with the board meetings, to share that information. So it's a very good question. Boards are a very important part of the organization as well, and they need to understand how to protect data.
Thank you,
If I may
Adriana.
chime in briefly on that answer as well, just quickly. I think one thing that Adriana hit on is a good one as far as just educate yourself too, as far as due diligence on the tools you use. Right? Understand where that cloud recording is going to be placed. Understand, can you encrypt it? Can I control who can eavesdrop or not? I mean, I think there's a level of responsibility that, so all of us as security practitioners try to mitigate certain risk, right, as best we can. But the education piece and educating ourselves in terms of the tools we use is still an important thing we have to do, right? It's still something that we can't take for granted that something's safe, because chances are it's not. We can't assume that. So we have to make sure that it is. We ask the right questions. Is this the tool we want to use? If not, it may not be our corporate standard, but for the board meetings, we are going to use a different tool that does have the security controls we need. So it's really just making sure what we do have, we educate ourselves, and then yes, absolutely educate the people using it that, hey, you may not want to say certain things like in this particular type of call, or we're using this particular streaming service, whatever it is. You kind of tailor that messaging based on what you're going to use and what you do know and can confirm about it.
Thank you very
Well,
much.
That takes us to the end. So thank you very much, everybody.
Yep. Thank you very much, Mark, for moderating this session. John, Adriana, and Michael for looping in and representing the siberXchange Advisory Board, as well as your respective organizations. And once again, a thank you to Palo Alto for making the entire morning possible. We've had viewers from around the world listening in and lots of great conversations. So once again, our friends at Palo Alto, Jason and Anu, we appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you at the next siberXchanges. Take care and have a wonderful rest of the day.
You as well.
Thank you.
I know.
Cheers.